Thank you for joining us. I very much appreciate you taking the time. Joined a webinar focusing on street sweeping. Judging by attendance, it's a topic that's on a lot of people's minds. My name is Chris Capelli, and I'm the president of Second Nature. I'm joined today by our founder and CEO, Nicole. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi all. I'm sitting over here in Santa Cruz, California, and a trained academic that has spent a lot of time thinking about how to optimize street sweeping and using GIS.
So just some logistics. So we're going to do a combination of slides and just talking through some of these topics. Prior to joining Second Nature, I had worked at Esri for 30 years, and street sweeping, while I conceptually understood it, I didn't really understand it until I had the opportunity to meet Nicole and learn from her. So our thought in this webinar was to present some of those learned lessons, best practices, and the results of conversations that Nicole and I have had with people for the last 6 months as we've explored this topic in preparation for this webinar. So Nicole, how about if we start out with a personal story from your side?
I really can't start a webinar on street sweeping without mentioning Dick Mento. I met Dick in 2009. He's the was the municipal maintenance manager in Incline Village, Nevada. Actually sought him out. We had been doing a large amount of work in Lake Tahoe. That was 9 years after the Federal Restoration Act was signed. So about $1 billion had gone into keeping Tahoe blue, and half of that money was focused at improving water quality. We had taken the water quality monitoring that had been done by UC Davis for 22 different urban catchments. And we had normalized those loads and concentrations and ranked them from high to low, sites that generated more pollution versus less. Incline Village had 2 sites that, from a land use perspective, looked like all the other sites, but they were orders of magnitude cleaner. So I found myself in Dick Mento's office, told him that fact, and he said, "Come with me," and immediately took me down to the yard and introduced us to his sweepers and said, "My sweepers are my most cost-effective stormwater BMP." He continued to then talk about the fact that with the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been invested in constructed wetlands and fancy treatment vaults and different types of structural BMPs, that he learned pretty quickly that as soon as those accepted water, one big wetland in particular, he said it looked like an alluvial fan after the first rainstorm, where there was just so much debris and abrasives that had been brought into that. Tahoe had banned salt years before, so they had to rely on abrasives to protect driver safety from all the goofballs like myself who live by the ocean and then go up to the snow and think they can drive. So we talked a lot about, the protecting the useful life of his infrastructure, the real value of street sweeping and maintaining roads, and learned a lot from him for sure. We called him the mobile BMP Yoda. So fast forward, this is, again, I've spent a lot of time looking and thinking about the effectiveness of street sweeping. This is the results of a simple little experiment that was done in a public education and outreach event. Kids swept a little 1-by-1 square before and after a sweeper went by, put it into a jar and filled it with water and shook it up. So there's visual evidence, and then there's tons of research and studies, and it's growing every day, that indicate street sweeping can remove 90% of the debris and particulates and associated pollutants from impervious surfaces, and the costs of street sweeping can be as little as half of the cost of structural controls per pound of pollution removed. So how's that for a life story?
Well, it's I've heard you say it several times now, and I think there's lots of important lessons in there, because I think for most people, they don't understand the impact of the street sweeper. Certainly from the public's point of view, I think that's true. And, there's a lot of pieces to put together to be able to do that. And I should also say, you may have an unfair advantage since you have a PhD in aquatic chemistry. one of the things we agreed to before we did this webinar is you'd start with providing people with like the three most important things from your perspective.
All right. So if you take away three things, I think the first is double down on the efforts, double down your efforts in the areas of concern. I mean, to maximize the impact of your street sweeping program, you really want to focus in areas that are critical infrastructure. And these days, honestly, more prone to localized flooding. All communities are facing undersized, aging infrastructure, and climate change is only making that worse. By leveraging the knowledge of your city maintenance team, like your Dick Mentos, who have boots on the ground and insight, you can start thinking about and understanding where critical infrastructure is, and how to maintain the areas around them, reduce the amount of debris. So collaborate with those folks. They're invaluable for sure. And consider areas, high density of human activities or tree canopy. And there's a lot of different ways to talk about or think about areas of concern. We'll go into that today. But I think the takeaway there is, think about effective street sweeping. It goes beyond water quality and really can protect human safety and boost climate resilience. The second one, got to get to the curb. I should say a lot. I've stared at roads and thought about pollutant generation and transport over my career on roads, probably more than I care to admit. But it's clear that even the dirtiest roads that pose the greatest risk, their drive lanes are clean due to the traffic and wind. And so all that material and the pollution and the trash, litter, it's all accumulating at the curb. Which is also, if you think about it, that critical flow path that now stormwater is being routed to that curb and has a lot of power to transport it. So when your sweepers sweep in the middle of the road, it's wasting money and wasting time. So it's non-trivial to figure out how to get to the curb, but being creative and finding solutions help you understand and maximize the effectiveness of your program. And if you collect data, well, then you can start understanding what works where and what doesn't. And then three, I think the third most important is obviously the people, engaging your stakeholders, leadership, peers, and the public. So highlight the role of street sweeping as a local climate adaptation and resilience solution, right? Reframe it to your leadership and the public as an invaluable program to reduce local flood risk, right? It won't do much associated with those areas adjacent to, big streams or waterways when you have massive storms, but certainly internally, right, we're all struggling with capacity issues, and street sweeping can really help protect that. Include officials in your community events, collaborate with your peers and traffic and municipal operators, and explore incentives and different ways to listen to your community before, just thinking aggressive ticketing is the only option. So I think by making street sweeping a shared community effort, you can really build a stronger, program and build more support for achieving long-term success. So they're my top three.
Okay, well, good. Thank you for boiling it down. So I just want to go back to that previous slide, but not necessarily showing it because those jars kind of disgusting. But that's actually an example of of a public education and outreach event where one of our users took a sweet sweeper out to a local park, had a community event, and ran kind of citizen science. I think that's such a powerful way to double down on that and really engage people in understanding why that sweeper accessing the curb is so important. So those are great points. And yes, I hear you constantly say, get to the curb. You say it every day. So, all right, so we're going to move on because we're going to kind of pick up the pace a little bit because there's a lot of content to get through. And I'm going to show you something I typically wouldn't show, which is the mind map that sits behind this entire webinar. I have a copy of this available. It will be sending out after the webinar. What we thought we would do is we tried to connect the dots and then go through each of those points and make sure they were actually the important ones. Now, we may have missed something, or we may not get something exactly right, or your point of view may differ. What we just wanted to do was present what we were thinking and what we were hearing in the conversations we were having with our users and other stormwater agencies across the US. There are 4 big topics left. First one is going to be challenges and opportunities. Second one is going to be number 3, that's technically is critical factors. The next is the power of GIS. And then the last is pulling it all together. So we're going to go through each of these sections, but realize they're chained together quite a bit. So Nicole, before I turn off the slides and we just have a conversation about these, what I was hoping to do is just I'll give them a quick perspective on these topics and why we chose them. And then if you could, I'll start to go into each of them with you. The 5 that we really kind of settled on at the end of the day were, as Nicole had said, climate resiliency. I don't think most people associate their street sweeper with climate resiliency. Preserving hydraulic capacity is maybe not an obvious one, but one that we've heard many municipalities were using a sweeper to help with. Protecting assets and extending useful life, complying with TMDLs, and last but not least, tracking those efforts. So Nicole, why don't you give us just a minute on climate resiliency and preserving hydraulic capacity?
I think everybody can, right, pay attention to the news cycles. We have more intense rainfalls coming more frequently. I mean, it feels different. The data is reinforcing it. Climate scientists have been saying it forever, right? So stormwater teams are really on the front lines facing that anxiety. And it really stresses a local community out, I think, right? They're kind of left holding the bag, dealing with this now change in our precipitation patterns. But what I've also seen is that, when cities write climate adaptation plans, really rare to have anything about stormwater management in it, and particularly nothing about street sweeping, right? And I think that should change, right? This is a real tool in the toolbox to help communities work with the resources that they have, to be able to build incorporate this into their disaster avoidance strategy. So.
Yeah, and Nicole, sorry, before you go on, one thing that popped in my mind from last week, we were talking to somebody and you made the immediate connection that they could potentially get funds through climate resiliency to pay for street sweepers or to contract out street sweeping. Anything to say about that?
Yeah. Well, White House put out a resiliency strategy and said it's on the dollar, $6 cheaper to avoid disaster than it is to clean up after disasters. And so there's more and more investment from FEMA and other types of federal agencies on thinking about disaster avoidance. And I think this is a critical piece of it. And like we said, it's pretty cost-effective solution. And I think just, again, broadening our messaging and kind of branding of what street sweeping can do for a community, it's much broader.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Okay, so let's move on to that next one, preserving the hydraulic capacity of the lines. And
we support WEF, the Water Environment Foundation. They do MS4 surveys every other year, and we stand up a dashboard to help summarize their findings. And the number one challenge in every one of those surveys is aging infrastructure. So in addition to aging, they're also undersized, just inherently because of the change of climate and also increased development. So our localized flood hazard is increasing. Then clogging and debris, it's only exacerbating that issue. So here's a great picture. I don't know, Chris, which community you got this from, but this is a CCTV that just looks like a huge debris pile in their storm drain line. That's common, and managing and using street sweeping can help protect that capacity.
Well, yeah, that's the connection. Your Dicmento story, to me, it's probably not just clean above, but it's also clean below, which kind of bridges that next topic of protecting critical assets.
Yeah, well, like I told the Dick's Minto story, but California has gotten new trash requirements that if now are across the state, they're going across the country, and one of the solutions as an option is to put 5 mm screens on stormwater infrastructure on catch basins. So you're already reducing now the capacity of those, and the water's got to go somewhere. So it's protecting and extending the useful life of those assets. It's gonna you get clogged infrastructure, the water will create erosion and exacerbate infrastructure failures. And so, continued, we want to reduce the frequency of sinkholes and infrastructure destruction. So I think there's a real value in extending useful life by being proactive in doing this pollutant ground control or debris ground control rather than trying to treat it or clean it up once it's in your system.
All right, so let's talk about the last two. I mean, complying with team deals is a tough one for many communities we talk to. How do you think the street sweeper is really going to help them with that problem?
Yeah, and that's the whole intent of your MS4 permit, right? Regulators have teeth on the receiving water quality, so they're linking the impaired waterways with your municipal discharges to it. And like I said, there's a real cost-effective opportunity to remove urban pollution. I mean, one study said $3 to $5 per pound of urban pollutants is the cost of street sweeping. So street sweeping can be a fundamental element in any pollutant load reduction plan and targets, and being able to reliably track and account and take credit for your program. Heck of a lot easier if we're using the tools that we're talking about in here with GIS and sound data. And then go ahead.
Track effort. No, I was going to say you're going right there. So then go right to track efforts.
Yeah, and the permits across the country. I mean, we've looked at all of them. Honestly, I feel like I've read so many permits across the states. The majority of the permit requirements for street sweeping are have a program, prioritize your routes, have some sort of strategy associated with prioritizing them, and then report the miles that you have swept each year and how much material you picked up. I mean, that can be done in a spreadsheet and pretty simple so that you can get those big numbers out, or we can collect and manage the data as a strategy a little bit better. And that'll boost your operational efficiency. You start gaining some insights. And then, of course, these pollution reduction credits. And we'll get into the details on that. But it can be a challenge tracking efforts. So making it work as best for you and getting powerful data is really kind of what excites me and the Second Nature science team.
Keep the sweeper moving. And get to the next set of topics, because this is a pretty dense set. I think as we started to explore this, I wasn't surprised by how many sources of pollution there were that a sweeper could actually help to resolve. So how about if we spend a little bit of time talking about the pollution sources, just so that we all kind of share that same point of view.
Sure thing. And they vary in location and time, right? We can spend a ton of time thinking about the pollution sources. Generally, they're construction activities. Those are temporary. Of course, that'll generate debris. Traffic and vehicle wear, leakage, emissions, huge source of trace metals. And honestly, if I had to pick one that was kind of the most toxic source of pollution, I'd probably picked roads. There's seasonal, like I said, variations in littering and in leaf litter and trees, right? Those can be sources of clogging your infrastructure, like I talked about, those 5mm screens in the fall. Illegal dumping. And Chris, the story you love to tell about your coastal sand accumulations now that you live at the beach. So that also becomes a seasonal battle. Keep the infrastructure clear when the wind blows the wrong way.
I mean, there's no one size fits all for this. So what's the number one source that you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, cars, honestly, the Washington State aquatic toxicology professor. Her name's Jennifer McIntyre. I've been a big fan of her for a long time. She does a lot of work on the toxicity of highway runoff, and all the different organic and inorganic trace metals, copper out of brake pads, zinc leakage, oil, hydrocarbons. I mean, it just, cars are a pretty causal source of pollutants. But the good news, I think, is that an effective sweeper doesn't discriminate by the pollutant. So while you need to understand kind of the wear and the seasonality, you get a sweeper there before it rains, recover that debris and that pollution before the rain transports that pollution into your stormwater system is really the goal and the objective.
I know road characteristics have a play in this. What's the biggest ones you think are?
Yeah, I mean, land use is the most common, right? If anybody's going to think about modeling or predicting where those sources are, they're going to start with land use. Something we learned right away is that not all land uses are created equal. You may have really clean commercial areas versus really dirty commercial areas. So it's a good starting place, but going a little bit beyond land use is pretty key. Again, traffic and parking density, that's a better indicator, particularly in the roadway areas. And human density, right? To more people, more trash, more debris. Obviously, tree canopy is another great one. That's a huge focus, controlling leaf litter as a nutrient source in the Great Lakes region, that protect and reduce the amount of phosphorus going into their waterways. And then the last one, I don't think people think of as much. Again, learned this from my mobile BMP Yoda, Dick Mento, is the pavement condition index. And he literally, after we were in the yard, he then drug me out to one of the roads and said, look at these cracks in my road, right? So the alligator roads, one, I can't get that debris back once it's cracking. My sweeper, no matter how efficient that sweeper is, I can't get that debris back. And now the road is actually becoming a source because it's degrading. So maybe another value of arguing when you go to get resources and funding to repave your roads is actually kind of as a climate adaptation benefit and a water quality benefit as well.
Great point. Okay, how about areas of concern?
Yeah, again, we have massive hurricanes and storms coming through, right? At some point, no level of disaster planning is going to help a city. But strategic O&M and street sweeping, it'll reduce the local flood hazards. I think that starts with knowing where those flood prone areas are, right? Internal to the city, where are the areas that are commonly, backing up or flooding because of poor drainage and likely because of undersized infrastructure, right? And then where are your critical infrastructure? Right? What catch basins and cleanouts can you flag that you really want to keep protected because those lines or that system is they're on critical routes, right? They're roadways to hospitals or schools. Above all on those three things is go to your municipal maintenance teams. They know this stuff, right? They're the ones that have to respond to the resident and the leadership phone calls on Christmas Eve when it's pouring like crazy. Right, include them in your process of trying to understand those areas of concern. And then the last one is again the areas of waterways area. They're either biological significant or TMDL listed streams. And if you map your urban catchment so that you understand how stormwater is flowing through your city, it's pretty easy to know which areas are draining to really sensitive waterways and ones that you may need to, again, double down on that area.
So operational logistics, Nicole, I know there were three things on your mind on this one.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, there are three knobs you can really turn, with the exception of pavement condition index, right? Maintain the integrity of your road. That doesn't always fall right on the street sweeping team. But the three knobs you can turn are sweeper type. There's generally three types of different sweepers. There's a mechanical broom, and then vacuum assist and regenerative air, we can just bulk those up and call them high efficiency sweepers. So the mechanical broom is just running a broom. It doesn't have a vacuum, and it's not getting as close to the surface. So it's really great for bulky debris, like trash and blankets and leaf litter. And you can sweep wet streets with a mechanical broom. And it has lower operational and maintenance costs compared to those high efficiency sweepers. The downside is you can't pick up that fine material, and that's where all the pollution is, where all the toxicity, where the phosphorus, right? The fines are really where a lot of that pollution and toxicity is residing. On the flip side, those high efficiency sweepers, that's what they're designed to do. They're designed to pick up that fine material that, right, bind the toxic pollutants, but they rapidly clog with bulky debris, and that results in higher O&M costs. And they're not very well suited for wet conditions. So depending upon, we'll talk about when to use which one, but each of them have their pros and cons. From a purchase or a capital perspective, they're comparable. Like buy a mechanical broom or buy a vacuum assist, they generally are, in the hundreds of thousands of dollar range. Like we said, you can get some grant funding for those. The second is street sweeping, right? That's a frequency, right? It's a logistical problem. You have a certain amount of sweepers and labor hours. How do you distribute that across your routes? Ideally, you want to optimize that, right? Where you're getting your biggest return for the money that you're investing. Sweeping clean roads, a little bit of a waste of money, right? You don't want to go there all the time if there isn't any debris accumulating. And on the flip side, we don't want to wait too long, because then you're creating that infrastructure clogging and failure risk. So thinking about how to optimize that and maintain your road condition and how to do that's certainly a consideration. And you can use data, and we'll talk about that, how to optimize your sweeping frequency. And then the last is curb access. We already talked about that, right? Sweeping the middle of the road. Yeah, we want to think about creative ways to get to the curb. So 3 knobs you can turn: sweeper type, sweeping frequency, and curb accessibility.
Okay, awesome. So now I'm going to push you just a little bit. So on the people side.
Yeah, 3 groups, same thing. Those operators, boots on the ground, they're invaluable. Your peers and your traffic team and your municipal maintenance team. And elevating their role in the city's adaptation strategy and flood protection. Like when we talk to the municipal maintenance and the street sweeping crew, they feel valued, and that's awesome. And they have a lot of information to offer. Internal stakeholders are your leadership and your electeds. Include them in the community event, that JAR event that we talked about. The local city council member whose district that was in was at the event and gave a little speech and made the news cycle because he was there. And then the community, particularly the car owners, right? And the residents where curb access is a challenge. But start thinking about different ways to incorporate the public into your public education and outreach program as a street sweeping campaign.
Nicole, let's go into the power of GIS. And this section we went back and forth on, because obviously I'm a bit of a GIS geek, so I can find a reason for a map in anything. But the challenge came is, let's break it into 2 kind of areas. The first is the compliance. Many, if not all of you, have to submit something to the regulator, and you may not have much yet to go on. So you typically are using maybe spreadsheets or reporting like that. But there is a role for maps that can get you a little bit maybe clearer results, or a different way of presenting the results maybe to the public or your constituents and stakeholders. The other big one was, we called it integrated asset management, and I'm really liking that term a lot, because it's a more holistic approach, kind of to all the factors that you were mentioning, Nicole. Kind of brings those all together, and it does highlight the power of GIS. And before we dive into this one, I just want to highlight it by saying, you don't have to be, there is no perfect. I think you could take bits and pieces from these things and steadily, maybe over time, work to incorporate some of or all into your program. So we're not trying to present you with a the thing you have to do tomorrow, but hopefully more just inspire you that even with the most basic data, you can start to really turn up the impact of your sweeping efforts. So Nicole, in that light, how about if we start on compliance? Because that's probably 50 to 60% of the conversations you and I have with people, the reality of where they are today.
Yeah, and the majority of where groups are is they're having their operators collect the day they swept, what route did they sweep, and how much material did they clean up, and how many miles did they cover, right? That's a spreadsheet tracking exercise. It can be simple or complex. You're able to get those kind of basic requirements back to the regulator, right? They have an effort-based reporting. How many miles do we sweep? How much do we pick up? And maybe you have a prioritization of your routes that you can communicate. I know that reporting that total, you get the total number of, tons or cubic yards of debris. Then what, right? Is that very satisfying, right? So are the roads clean? I mean, we don't know how much is done. So it's hard to infer from that data to optimize efforts and understand how to get the greatest return on investment. So that's where, I like the integrated asset management approach too, where now with the digital tools and slightly more organized data and GIS, well, all of a sudden our data is becoming transformed into actionable insights.
The reality is that many organizations have to do the spreadsheet. That's where they are right now. They get a printed ticket maybe from the dump when the truck's finished its sweeping route. They collate those and they present them in a table. You can start to use that data to also start making maps, especially if you actually outline your routes and can associate the tickets to the route. You're now starting to see some spatial trending on a map, which I don't want to discount. So even a little GIS can go a long way if all you have are those spreadsheets. Now, I know you're excited as I am about this integrated asset management and to kind of dive in, but it does require a bit more effort and what we wanted to outline is kind of our thought process for how we go through it when we work with our users. So Nicole, let's hit on collect.
Yeah, I think there's three main pieces of groups of data to collect. The first is just getting what Chris said, getting your routes into GIS. Go back to that public education and outreach event. If you have that, one of the activities that they did at that event is the people who attended came and put a pin on where they live so that we knew who attended and what routes were they in. So the value of that can go beyond just the simple effort-based reporting. But once you have your routes in GIS, I think there's four main things that we can show. Yeah, here we are. So you can map what's your predominant sweeper type? How's the sweeper being used across the city? What's your plan? Curb access. What's the average curb accessibility? And we do this categorically. You'll see an example of that in a minute. And if you don't have the data, that's fine. We got some tricks up our sleeve that you can think about, like a simple field maps, Esri Field Maps app, where you take your intern and you go drive, the routes at the day and time it's supposed to be scheduled and do your best estimate of curb accessibility at those times. You can have discussions with your operators, get their impressions for each route on the curb accessibility. Google Street View is another good example, but you can't always control the day and time of the imagery that you have available. Then frequency. What's your frequency for each route? Are you sweeping them all every other week? Do you have some dynamic or variability in that frequency, and keeping track of that really useful. And then the last, if you have it, pavement condition index. A lot of groups, traffic. Again, collaborate with your peers at traffic. They usually have traffic pavement condition index surveys. Super valuable information to understand where the areas of concern might be from a condition perspective.
Yeah, and Nicole, I want to highlight that map kind of in the background because I don't know if many people have it yet. But a simple way to produce that is almost everybody has street center lines. If not, you can get them pretty readily. We just used the buffer tool inside of our GIS to create that buffer, do some editing to split the lines, and now we can associate and build out a route which represents both sides of the street. That's what you're now seeing in those 4 different classification maps, is with those maps or those lines as context, and now get a pretty detailed view of my street sweeping efforts. It may seem like a lot. It's actually not a complex exercise, and definitely one you can work through if you haven't. And as Nicole said, we certainly have some best practices and ideas on how to do that. And you're always welcome to reach out to us to get our advice or our assistance.
All right. So areas of concern, that I won't belabor this one, but we talked a lot about what those are. Polygons on the map, where your undersized infrastructure, where your area is prone to flooding, where's your critical infrastructure? Again, where are the areas that if you had to run out before a big storm or rain, where would you want the capacity at its maximum? That could, again, either be undersized infrastructure. It could also be routes to schools or hospitals or other reasons. Trash assessments, another great way to understand where your trash distribution is and where the areas are that are more trashy than others. Another interesting way to use a mobile application and look at mapping trash distribution. And we actually have a public peer-reviewed publication on how to take that line data and turn it into current trash distribution map. But super valuable to, again, understand where your areas of litter and debris are accumulating more. And then the last are those seasonal areas, right? Whether it's the sand at the beach or maybe you have a big 4th of July parade and you need to sweep a certain area on the 4th of July, or that fall leaf litter issue. Understanding where those areas of concern are and when they are.
Well, you highlighted a tool for doing that, and I don't think these have to be like super accurate. It's basically being able to maybe use field maps or Survey 123, both ArcGIS tools that most people probably have, to go out and just do a rapid survey. We've seen many of our users, in the time it takes them to drive the street, be able to get a rapid trash assessment. And I know you and I were talking about the frequency of that. I think starting out even once would be great, but imagine starting to be able to do that maybe quarterly or even monthly. Now you can start to see and understand how trash and maybe sweeping effectiveness vary over time. It's another easy way, even if you don't collect all the sweeper data, it's a way of ground truthing and collecting that information and have something to use.
Yeah, and a great way to get your field teams, like your interns or stormwater staff, out into the field and they become boots on the ground. They got to go and look at the landscape and better understand the pollution generation. So, all right. So it doesn't have to be overly complicated. This is a form that we use. Understanding and having data within a system and being able to make it reliable and reasonable, right? So you see even, which route are you on? And then when we talk about curb access, it's categorical from very high to very low, right? So you don't have to have an accurate, precise number. And it also then makes it easier for folks to understand what those differences are, and it makes it pretty efficient to do it, particularly after they've done a sweep. Generally, what do I think my curb access was? You can use the odometer to track the broom miles that have been swept, and then what's your sweeper type and how much did you recover once you go to the disposal station and weigh your vehicle and put that number in here. So super simple, but it's organized, and now you're gonna have a lot more power in that data.
Now, this is also an area that people can get even more advanced. So you can outfit your sweepers with GPS recorders and track them in real time. I think obviously already knows that technology is pretty advanced and anything's possible if you have the time, money, and kind of attention of the technical resources to help you. But this to me is kind of the money shot. Anybody can do this with a copy of field maps, or in our case in 2Inform, and automatically collect this information, correlate it, and let the analytics start. This is the analyze. Once you have the basic data, what are you going to do with it? And I think you've highlighted to me the importance of this ranking priority maps, and it's showed up in a lot of permits as well. And it's certainly critical for dialing in infrastructure protection and all the things that we talked about. So
yeah, so you can see a categorical distribution, right? It's not going to be perfect, but what you're doing is thinking about where your route priorities are across all of your routes. The first place to start, now we have data to do this. So we like to do this and kind of put a method to the madness, if you will. So it's like a 3-step process. So the first, you can use data that you have in the system to be able to evaluate which roads get dirtier fastest. And I get to now do a quick, fun little math. There's my one math experiment here with y'all. And so you have data, right? The data that is being required to be collected by being better organized, we can put it to use. So I'm going to start with just a simple little ducky bathtub experiment, and then I'll apply it to roads. So on Monday, you have an empty bathtub. You turn on the faucet, it's on low, constantly coming out of there. We're going to assume that's constant flow. On Saturday, you have 20 gallons that you empty from that tub. The question is, how quickly, or what is the rate that tub is filling up? Well, we got 20 gallons over 5 days. The rate per day is 4 gallons per day. You can now apply that same concept to road debris accumulation. So I'm going to use the same data that was in that field, in the record sweep field. We swept 10 broom miles. The last time we swept was 10 days ago, because we're recording the date every time. And when we swept Route A, we collected 5 tons. Same concept. How much debris did we collect? Over what time period? We now have 0.5 tons per day. I can then normalize that by mile, right? All routes are not going to be the same length. So all I'm doing now is taking that 0.5 tons per day, and I'm dividing it by how many miles I swept, how many broom miles I swept for that particular route. Easy math here, but 0.0 tons per day per mile. The way that we aggregate it is looking at years. You can either do it event by event, or you can average those over a particular time period. So take the sum of all of those debris collected per mile per year for each of the sweeps, and then how many sweeps did you have? Now you have a KPI. What is my debris collected per mile, tons per mile for each year? And you can track that as a whole over your entire system or for every single route. It becomes super valuable to then start ranking routes initially on which ones get dirtiest fastest and which ones get dirtier less fast, if you will. So that's the first strategy. Rank them using this information. Then the second step, so now you have an initial grouping or ranking. Then you evaluate, are there any of these routes that have low curb accessibility? I've already, got to get to the curb. Your debris that you collect is going to be biased low or low because you're not getting to the curb. So if you have low curb accessibility, we start then moving up some of those routes, at least one category. And again, this is a great time to then either go out and check out the routes or collaborate with your municipal maintenance crews. But you start adjusting those to match your intuition. And then the last is now boost those routes that are in the areas of concern, right? Do we miss any? And some of them are tagged very low or low. And maybe those are areas of critical infrastructure. Do we need to move those up one category or multiple categories? Again, it's not perfect, do your best, but in the end, you want a relative grouping using data to allocate your resources and priorities. Yeah, an axe, pretty straightforward, right? 3 knobs. We can adjust the sweeping frequency. Start thinking about that now, right? We don't want to sweep clean roads. So do you have some lower priority routes that maybe you could allocate some resources into very high or high priority? Sweeper type. We already talked about that. We love a lot of groups we're seeing have both sweeper types. When you have bulky debris and really dirty sites, or you have special sweeps, use your mechanical broom. If you have the resources and the capacity to then also get a regenerative air or a vacuum assist, use that to do the polishing and the fine cleaning. And then the last is curb access. Think about different creative ways to adjust curb access. Evaluate the days and times. Can you go back out and understand which days or times maybe you have more access, you would have more access in particular routes? Do the whole targeted public education and outreach campaign that we talked about. Try to, huge opportunity for your public education and outreach to have a campaign rather than what we like to call random acts of outreach. And then obviously the last solution to curb access is signage and parking enforcement, right? It's non-trivial cost to put up signs if you have unsigned routes. So make sure that you feel pretty confident and you've done your outreach due diligence. That'll help with the PR as well as the effectiveness of those parking controls.
Okay, so how about something on evaluating effectiveness?
Yeah, it's common in every permit, right? Evaluate the effectiveness of your construction program or your street sweeping program. So with the power of data, you have a world of possibilities, and I'll just give you 3. The first is just reporting on your efforts. It's way easier now to report on the miles swept and the debris picked up. But now you have the granularity to go all the way down to each route or specific routes or specific areas. The second is look at trends in curb accessibility. If you're targeting a campaign in a particular area to increase curb accessibility, is that changing for those routes that you're targeting? Are you boosting the curb accessibility in your very high and high routes? That becomes a priority. That can be a way to evaluate effectiveness of your public education and outreach program. What about trends in critical infrastructure conditions? Do we clean catch basins less often, or the green infrastructure, do they need less frequent cleaning? Great way to look at the effectiveness of your street sweeping program because you're saving O&M dollars in demand on those assets downstream. When you have a program in GIS and you have route-specific O&M details, it's pretty easy to leverage the breadth of national sweeper effectiveness studies. You can assign pollutant concentrations to every route before and after your sweeping program is implemented. And that's essentially going to provide you a data-driven way to quantify and track the water quality benefits of your street sweeping program. So there are my top 4.
No, they're great. I think it's the power of the data is what we're really getting at, and the ability to be able to share that back with the regulator. And it's also the power of being able to communicate across. I mean, stormwater is a team sport. So the ability to use data, maps, and knowledge to share with the various colleagues and peers in the city and in the community can really make a huge, huge difference. That's what I'm taking away from this section. And I think it can also save directly on maintenance costs. We can keep the sediment out of the pipes. You can keep the catch basins from clogging, especially if they have those screens on them for trash capture. You keep the local areas from flooding. Yeah, it's a big deal. So we have crammed a lot into this. So I'm going to try to bring it back on just the 3. Nicole, are you convinced these 3 are still the 3? Doubling down on areas of concern, I think for me, the takeaway is, you said it, you don't need to sweep clean streets. So if there's any way of adjusting routes based on that information. It's a savings in terms of the mileage of the sweeper, but maybe the concentrating on areas where you really need to double down to protect. This may come into play, before major storms or changes in season. So that resonates with me. To get to the curb, until I drive down the street or I ride on my bike on the side of the curb, and darn if I don't get a flat and think of you, because all the stuff is kind of pushed over into the curb. So,
Yeah.
and I can't get this out of my mind in terms of public education outreach. I just thought this was so clever and so thoughtful to be able to involve kids in citizen science to help influence their parents and future generations. So that's our workshop on street sweeping. I hope that our thoughts and ideas and what we're reflecting and what we've learned from others was useful to you all. Very much appreciate you joining us. And as always, if you have any questions or need any help, we're always here for you. Thanks very much.
Bye, y'all.